The matchmaker lowered her voice the way people do when they mean to be overheard. "I'll be straight with you, Mr. Calder, since you've come a long way. She's got 3 children and no husband to show for them. Widowed, she says. And maybe so. But 3 little ones and a dead man's debts is a hard wagon to hitch any decent rancher to. And I'd not have written you about her at all, except you said you weren't particular." She slid the woman's letter across the table of the Cedar Gap Hotel, as though it might stain. Most men want a fresh start. A girl with no encumbrances. Not a ready-made brood of someone else's. And Hank Calder, who had ridden 2 days down into the Texas hill country through the first blue norther of that cold late autumn of 1890. Read the letter once, and looked out the window at the wind stripping the live oaks, and said the thing the matchmaker would repeat to every soul in Cedar Gap before the week was out, because it made no sense to her at all. 3 children and no husband, Hank said. Then she's perfect for me. The matchmaker waited for him to laugh or explain. He did neither. He folded the letter careful and put it in his coat over his heart and stood up to go and meet her. If you have ever been counted as too much trouble to want, 3 mouths and a hard history, and a wagon no decent man would hitch to, stay with me tonight. Subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because the reason that rancher called a widow and her 3 children perfect, and what it cost him to make those words good when the whole thing came up for grabs, is something I have carried for 40 years and never once been able to set down. Now come back with me to that wind-scoured hill town, and the man riding out to meet a family the world had written off. His name was Hank Calder, and he ranched a fine spread up the Guadalupe breaks that he had not earned, and could not, by the terms of it, easily keep. His uncle Amos Calder had built the place and died bitter about legacy, and the will the old man left was a cruelty dressed as a gift. The ranch came to Hank. But only if Hank was a married man with a family by his 40th birthday, which fell that coming spring, and the words the old lawyer read out were heirs of his body, and failing that the whole of it passed to Amos's other nephew, a soft, prosperous man named Del Calder, who had been counting the days for years. The old man had written that clause not knowing, or not caring. The one thing about Hank that made it a knife, that Hank Calder could not father a child. He had learned it across 11 years, married to a good woman named Sarah, who had wanted babies more than breath and never carried one, and a doctor in San Antonio had told him plainly the fault was his. Some fever of his boyhood that had quietly unmanned him in the one way a man out here was measured. Sarah had died of a snake bite 4 summers back, still loving him, and Hank had buried her, believing he could give a woman everything but the one thing she'd wanted, and had made his peace with dying without a family. Then his uncle's will had made a family the price of his home. And Hank had sat with that joke a long time. He would not marry a young girl and watch her grief slowly understand that no children would ever come. He'd done that once and would not do it twice. And then a thought had come to him, quiet and then certain, that there was somewhere a woman who already had her children, for whom his great lack would be no lack at all. A woman the world called too much trouble, 3 kids and no husband, was, to Hank Calder alone of all the men in Texas, not a burden, but the answer to the one thing he could never otherwise have. Eliza Burnett had not always been a wagon no man would hitch to. She had been a blacksmith's daughter, and then a blacksmith's wife, married to a big laughing man named Tom Burnett, who'd been better at laughing than at staying out of debt, and who had died of a burst appendix 2 winters back, leaving her 3 children and a forge mortgaged past saving. She had tried to hold it. She could shoe a horse and mend a wheel as well as Tom ever had, having grown up at the Bellows. But a woman's smith was a thing the county would not bring its business to, no matter how true her welds. And the bank had been polite, and the work had dried up, and she had watched her children get thin. She had 3. Samuel, 10, gone hard and watchful and the man of the house since he was 8. Lily, 6, careful and quiet. And Rosie, 3, who did not yet know the family was in trouble, and was the only one of them who still laughed easy. Eliza had answered the advertisement of a hill country rancher because there was nothing left in Cedar Gap but the slow watching of her children go hungry, and she had written the truth on paper. 3 children, widowed, no money. Because she would not start a thing on a lie, and because she expected the truth to end it before it began, the way the truth always had. She had felt the town's eyes the whole 2 years of her widowhood, the measuring look that landed on the 3 children, and did the cold arithmetic everyone did. Too many. Too costly. Who'd take that on? And she had learned to walk through it with her chin level and her children's hands held tight, never letting the lookers see it reach her. Because the children took everything from her face, and she would not teach them they were a burden by wearing it. The day Hank Calder's wagon came to fetch them from the Cedar Gap rooming house, the landlady stood in the door and said, "Not low enough. Lord help the man, taking on that litter." And Eliza Burnett gathered up Rosie on her hip and Lily's hand in hers and put Samuel to carrying the one trunk, and walked out to the wagon with her back straight and did not look back at the woman. Because she had stopped long ago, giving them the satisfaction. Hank Calder climbed down off the wagon seat and looked at the 3 children, and then at the woman, and he did not do the arithmetic. He looked at the boy Samuel's hard, watchful face, and the way the child had set himself between his mother and the strange man without thinking about it. And something in Hank's chest, which he thought he'd buried with Sarah, gave a low crack. "You'd be Samuel," he said to the boy, not to the woman, which Eliza noted. "Man who carries the trunk. I could use a hand that takes a job serious. There's a heap of work up at the place and not near enough hands. You hungry?" The boy, braced for a great many things but not for being needed, did not know what to do with the question. And Hank turned to Eliza and said, "Plain. It's a long ride up. There's a blue norther coming behind this one, and we'll want to be home before it. I'll tell you the truth of the place on the way, all of it, and if you want to turn around at the end of the telling, I'll bring you back myself. But I don't expect you'll want to." He lifted the trunk that Samuel was struggling with, easy, and set it in the wagon, and lifted little Rosie up after it before her mother could, gentle as if she were made of eggs, and Rosie looked at his weathered face and, being 3 and no judge of trouble, laughed. And Hank Calder went still for a half a second with his hands full of someone else's child, and then handed her up to her mother and climbed to the seat. And they went. He told her the truth on the long, cold ride up the breaks, the wind hard at their backs. He told her about the will, and the clause, and the 40th birthday in the spring, and the cousin Dell waiting to take it all. He told her she had a right to know she was marrying into a fight. And then, looking at the road, and not at her, he told her the other thing, the thing he had never said aloud to a soul but Sarah and a San Antonio doctor, because he would not let her find it out later and think she'd been deceived, that he could not give her a child of his own, that the fault was his, and certain, and that this was why a woman with 3 was not a burden to him, but, he'd say it plain, a gift. The only way a man like him would ever have a family at all. He said it flat, like a man reading off a list of a horse's faults before a sale, bracing for what came when women learned it. And Eliza Burnett, who had spent 2 years being told her children made her worthless, sat in the wind with that and finally said, "So the very thing that makes me too much trouble for every other man in Texas is the thing that makes me worth something to you. That's about the size of it," Hank said. Then we're each other's good luck, Eliza said, which neither of us has had much of lately. And Hank Calder laughed, short and surprised, a sound he hadn't made in 4 years, and that was the beginning. The ranch house, when it rose up out of the dusk, was sound but grim. A good house a grieving man had stopped tending, the windows dark with grease film, the kitchen gone to a bachelor's competent ruin, flour open to the mice, the held-breath stillness of a place where nobody had laughed in 4 years. Eliza took it in with one long look and took off her coat. She did not survey it like a hired woman bracing to earn her keep. She rolled up arms that had swung a smith's hammer since she was a girl. And she had that kitchen turned out and scoured and a fire going inside the hour. The children set to hauling and sweeping, and the dark house began, for the first time since Sarah, to fill up with the noise of people living in it. Hank stood in the doorway watching the racket of it, the boy carrying wood, the careful girl wiping a window, the baby underfoot, the woman at the stove, and wore a look Eliza could not read, because she had never seen a man look at an ordinary loud full kitchen like it was a thing he had wanted his whole life and given up on. Which is exactly what it was. The meal that mattered came the second night, when the blue norther came down in earnest and shut them in, the temperature dropping 40 degrees between noon and dark the way it does in that country, the wind screaming around the eaves. Hank came in from seeing to the stock half froze and gray and hollow, with the particular hunger of a man who'd eaten 4 years of his own bad cooking, because there'd been no reason to do better. Eliza set in front of him a pot of chicken and dumplings. She'd wrung the neck of a hen that afternoon without ceremony, being a practical woman, and a pan of cornbread, the smell of it filling the cold house so thick a man could lean on it, and the 3 children already at the table loud and waiting. Hank took the first bite and stopped, just stopped, spoon down, his eyes gone somewhere far back, because the body remembers what the heart has done without, and a man does not sit down to a hot full table after 4 years of eating alone over the stove without it taking him somewhere. Eliza did not ask him where. She only said, "There's plenty, and the children eat like wolves, so mind your share," and the table laughed. And Hank came back from wherever he'd gone, and ate, and watched the laughing crowd of them over his bowl with that unreadable look, which Eliza was just beginning to read. It was Rosie who reached him first, as the littlest so often is. The baby, who feared nothing because nothing had taught her to yet, took to following Hank Calder around the place like a duckling. And one evening as he sat mending tack by the fire, she climbed into his lap uninvited, the way she'd have climbed her own dead father's, and fell asleep there against his chest with her fist in his shirt before he could decide what to do with his hands. Hank sat frozen, the tack forgotten, a sleeping 3-year-old, breathing slow against him, and looked over her head at Eliza with the helpless, wondering face of a man who has been handed, by someone too small to know she did it, the exact thing he had spent 4 years certain he would die without. "She does that to everyone," Eliza said softly, which was a kindness and not quite true. "Not to me she don't," Hank said low. "Nobody's done that to me." And Eliza understood, watching him hold her sleeping child like something he was afraid to set down, that whatever the will said about heirs of his body, this man had just become a father in the only way that ever truly took, and that no court in Texas could speak to what was happening by that fire. The harder thing came through the boy. Samuel did not melt the way the baby had. He had been the man of his house too long and trusted nothing, and he watched Hank for weeks the way you watch weather that's burned you. But Hank did not push, and did not perform, and did not try to buy the boy. He only kept needing him. Real needs. A fence that wanted 2 pair of hands, and a colt that wanted gentling, and a man's judgment asked on a thing a man would ask another man, until somewhere in the cold weeks the boy forgot to keep his guard up, and was just a boy, working alongside someone who treated his help as worth having. The night it turned, a heifer was calving wrong in the norther, and Hank and Samuel worked it together half the night in the freezing barn, and got the calf, and stood after in the lantern light, both of them bloody to the elbow, and grinning like fools, and Samuel said, without deciding to, Pa used to, and stopped, gone white, because he had not meant to say Pa anywhere near this man, and Hank Calder said, easy, not making anything of it. Your Pa'd be proud of how you handled that heifer. You kept your head. That's the whole of it. Keeping your head. And the boy's face did something it had not done in 2 years, and he scrubbed it rough with a bloody sleeve and looked away. And after that, he stopped watching Hank like weather and started watching him like a pattern to learn from. Which is a different thing entirely. The trouble came in the new year, when Del Calder learned his cousin had married. He rode up the brakes with the old lawyer and a smooth confidence, because he had done his reading, and he stood in the grand cold front room of the ranch his uncle built, and laid it out almost gently. I'm glad you found companionship, Hank, I am, but you've misunderstood the will, and I'd be a poor cousin to let you go on misunderstanding it. He nodded at the lawyer, who read the words out, heirs of his body. Your uncle's meaning was plain, children of your blood. Not a widow's brood by another man. Stepchildren are no heirs of your body, in law or in plain sense. And everyone in this county knows you can't. And here Del had the decency to leave it unsaid. But the unsaid thing filled the room. So the marriage, forgive me, changes nothing. The place comes to me in the spring regardless. I only came to spare you the false hope, and to say that children may of course stay on through the winter. I'm not a hard man. He looked at Eliza and her 3 with a soft pity that was worse than contempt. There's no shame in it. You simply can't make heirs of someone else's leavings. And Eliza Burnett, who had stood through 2 years of being called too much trouble, felt this one reach her. Because it was not aimed at her. It was aimed at the man who had called her children perfect, aimed at the deepest wound in him, the one he'd confessed to her on a cold wagon seat. And she watched it land on Hank, and saw him take it the way a man takes a blow he's been braced for his whole life. You can't make a family. You never could. The law itself says, these aren't yours. She saw him begin to believe it, and she found she was on her feet before she knew it. But Hank put his hand up, gentle, and she stopped, because she saw he had something to say, and needed to say it himself. Hank Calder did not raise his voice. He looked at his cousin a long moment, and then he looked at the 3 children, the baby on her mother's hip, the careful girl, the boy who'd called him nothing yet but had said Pa and swallowed it. And something settled in his face that had been unsettled for 4 years. You're right, Hank said quietly, and Del blinked. In law, you're likely right. They're not heirs of my body. I can't make those, and the whole county knows it, and you've come a long way to say so out loud in front of them, which I'll remember. He nodded slow. So here's what I've decided, cousin, and you can take it to the old lawyer and the courthouse and whoever else. Take the ranch. The room went silent. Take it in the spring. It's a fine place, and my uncle built it, and you've wanted it your whole life, and I find, standing here, that I don't want it near as much as I thought I did. Because the price of keeping it, the way you've laid it out, is calling these 3 children not mine. And I won't pay that. Not for 1,000 acres. Not for 10,000. He put his hand on Samuel's shoulder, and the boy did not pull away. These are my heirs. Not of my body. I've made my peace with my body. Took me 4 years and a widow with more sense than the rest of Texas to do it. But mine. I'd sooner be a hired man with that boy and those girls than the richest landholder in the hill country with an empty house and your good opinion. So take the ranch, Dell. You came up here thinking the land was the thing I couldn't bear to lose. He almost smiled. You picked wrong. And Dell Calder, who had ridden up certain that a man would do anything to keep his home, had no answer at all for a man who would give the home away to keep a family that the law said wasn't his, because such a man cannot be threatened with the loss of the very thing he just handed over. He gathered up the lawyer and left, and the will's deadline came in the spring, and the ranch passed to Dell exactly as Dell wished. And Hank Calder moved his wife and 3 children off the fine, spread up the brakes, and into a small rented place down near Cedar Gap, with a forge attached. Because Eliza could shoe a horse better than any man in the county, and Hank could ranch on shares. And they were poor, and they were not, for 1 hour, sorry. That night, the night he'd given the land away, Hank told her the last of it. Sitting by the fire of the grand house they were soon to leave. He turned his tin cup in his hands and said that the worst of being the way he was had never been Sarah's disappointment, which she'd hidden, but his own certainty that he was a kind of dead end, a man the future stopped at, a name that would die with him. Uncle Amos knew it when he wrote that clause, Hank said. He meant it cruel. Meant me to die, knowing I'd failed at the one thing. His jaw worked, and tonight I stood in his front room and gave his ranch away to keep 3 children that aren't mine by blood, and you know what I felt, Eliza? I felt the future open back up. First time in 11 years I'm not a dead end. That boy's going to know everything I know. Those girls are going to remember me. I'm somebody's, finally. Even if the law spells it different. Eliza did not tell him the law was a fool, though it was. She took the cup from his hands and held them, the big scarred hands of a man who just traded a fortune for a family, and she said, "You were never a dead end, Hank Calder. You were just waiting for the right children to find you. Mine took their time getting here, but they found you." And neither of them said anything more. The thing that left that county quiet was not a courtroom and not a speech in a church. It was the sight, that next year, of Hank Calder's forge. Because the news got around, the way news does, that Hank had given up the Calder ranch rather than disown a widow's 3 children, and the county did with that what counties do, which was first to call him a fool, and then, slowly, watching, to call him something else. They saw the boy Samuel grow into the trade at his stepfather's side and his mother's, the 3 of them working that forge until it was the busiest in the hill country. Because it turned out, a county that wouldn't bring its horses to a woman smith brought them gladly to a family. And the same men who'd done the cold arithmetic on Eliza's 3 children now stood in the warm forge yard tipping their hats to Mrs. Calder. And one day Dell Calder himself, the great ranch having proved more than a soft man could run, brought a wagon down to be mended, and stood in the doorway of the forge of the man he'd beggared, and watched the whole loud, thriving family of it, and went away without a word, having understood at last, too late, which of them had won the thing worth winning. And the county, which had watched the whole story, found it had nothing left to say about Hank Calder being a fool. Only a long quiet of men reconsidering what a rich man was. They were happy, in the small place with the forge, far happier than the grand cold house had ever let anyone be. Rosie grew up not remembering she'd ever had another father. Lily, the careful one, learned her letters, and then taught them. And Samuel, the hard, watchful boy who'd set himself between his mother and a stranger in a Cedar Gap street, called Hank Calder Pa out loud before that first year was out, in the ordinary course of asking him to pass the cornbread. And Hank had to leave the table for a minute and stand in the cold yard composing himself before he could come back. And Eliza let him go and said nothing. Because some things a man needs to feel in private before he can stand to feel them in company. Years on, 26 of them, Lily, grown and a schoolteacher, would be married in the Cedar Gap Church, and Hank Calder would walk her down the aisle because there was no one with a better right. A gray man with a Smith's shoulders, and Eliza would stand at the front and watch her careful middle child marry, and take up every inch of the life they'd built out of a forge and 3 children and a fortune well lost. She never once apologized again for the brood that 2 years of widowhood had taught her made her worthless, because she had found the one man in Texas who'd looked at 3 children and no husband, and seen not a burden, but the family he'd been told he could never have, and who had proved it the only way that ever counts, by giving up everything else to keep it. The children had never been her ruin. They never had been. They had only been waiting the whole time for the one man who needed exactly them, and in a small warm forge that the whole county came to, with her 3 grown and her husband Gray beside her, Eliza Calder was, at the long last of it, home. The rancher had said she was perfect for him. He had spent the rest of his life, and a ranch and his whole reordered heart, proving he had meant it.